Okay, welcome to the Real Estate Finance and Legal Opportunities in Communities of Innovation in a COVID World. I'm Will Germain, Senior Investment Officer with Ventas and your moderator for this discussion. We have two esteemed panelists today, and we're going to try to cover three areas. First, we're going to recap on the current real estate industry and the financing outlook. Second, we'll touch on financing opportunities and capital structures. And then last, we will discuss the implications of COVID on real estate contracts and the business of financing. But first, let me briefly introduce our panelists. First, we have Craig Harman. Craig is a partner in the real estate practice at McGuire Woods and is focused on real estate finance transactions. Craig's experience includes representation of financial institutions, credit tenants, developers, equity partners, and lenders in virtually all types of financial arrangements across various real estate asset classes. Next is Lance Patterson. Lance is the founder and CEO of Patterson Real Estate Advisory Group. Patterson is a capital placement and real estate finance advisory firm headquartered in Atlanta with offices around the country. Under Lance's leadership, the firm has closed over 250 transactions totaling $5 billion. Welcome, Craig and Lance, to the panel. And first, I will start on the state of the real estate industry. So the past 6 months have been unparalleled. Could each of you provide some general color and an outlook from your perspective based on your individual industries on really what's happened in the last 6 months? And I'll start with Lance, and then Craig, you can follow.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk for a little while this afternoon. So I would say that the state of our industry is pretty good, or maybe at worst it's okay. I do think there are some geographic differences depending on where you are in the country, but I would say for the most part, that's how we see it. I remember going back to when COVID hit us, and although it really began to be talked about maybe late last year, early this year, our world, the way I look at it, it was really mid-March. That's when things began to stop, and they stopped very quickly. And I remember thinking about what the rent collection and mortgage payments would be April 1st. This is what everybody in our industry was thinking about, and we suspected it was not going to be very good. And it ended up actually being okay. Maybe not as good as pre-COVID, but it was okay. And then we thought, well, May 1st, it's going to be terrible, of course. And it really was not. It was not as good as pre-COVID, but it was not terrible. And then we thought, well, June 1st, it'll be horrific. And then it wasn't. And we thought the same thing in July 1st, because at that point, everybody had spent their PPP loans or their unemployment payments. And it wasn't horrible. And that's kind of continued. And so I think that's a good representation of what's happened in the industry, with some exceptions. Obviously, hospitality is in a lot of difficulty right now. Certainly some retail, not all retail, but some retail is. But for the most part, I'd say our industry is in okay, if not even pretty good shape.
Yeah, I agree with that. And thank you, Will and Lance, for this opportunity to talk with you guys and our audience out there. I agree with what Lance said. In fact, I would say that given where it looked like we were going to be in the second or third week in March, I would have never at that point looked ahead 5 months and imagined that the S&P would be at a record level, or that some of these other things that Lance mentioned would have actually come to pass, like the failure of a real catastrophe on a lot of these fronts to materialize. Now, but plenty of catastrophes did materialize, of course. And I think it was, at least as far as the legal matters that started coming across my desk in late March, early April, and into May especially, it was pretty stunning, because we were reacting to situations that were driven by something that I just never anticipated, and certainly we'd never seen before, where all of a sudden people are, in fact, the government is telling us basically not to go about our daily lives. And given the fact that that happened, and that these massive failures and foreclosures and defaults, et cetera, didn't, for the most part, materialize. Pretty stunning, really. And I think it speaks to a resilience in our economy and in our financial markets that's fairly comforting. We did have some unique legal matters that were spawned by the COVID and the reactions to it. But all in all, I think I'd have to agree with what Lance started out by saying, which is the state is pretty good.
Mhm.
Great, great. So I guess, experiencing like the kind of current industry dynamic this year, maybe you each can provide, maybe a little bit of your perspective on the current, on the kind of future economic outlook, but then I think just comparing kind of where we are now to how things were during the Great Recession of 2008. And, maybe you can talk a little bit about like what were the similarities to kind of what we experienced kind of during this COVID crisis, and, what were some of the differences, any lessons learned that you'd like to share. And I'll start with Craig this time, and then Lance, you can jump in.
Okay.
Yeah, it is interesting to look back and compare this to 2008. And I'll speak for myself. I had a lot of conversations with people in the period in which we're talking, mid-March, late March, in which we expected a 2008 repeat, essentially, or at least I did. And that didn't really happen. There are some similarities, though. For instance, I do a lot of work in the institutional lender world, and similarly to 2008, we've seen institutional lenders on the debt side really pull in their horns. And we had a lot of financing matters that we were in the middle of in mid-March, late March, early April, in which the lenders backed out if it was a juncture in the transaction in which they could back out, or imposed requirements to a degree that you might not have seen otherwise, very particular about the details. So that sort of activity, at least in my world, did slow down dramatically, and that segment of it felt sort of like the 2008 environment. But we didn't see a continuation of that, except, as Lance mentioned, in a couple different sectors. Hospitality was mentioned. Hospitality took an immediate hit. The loans, I expected in late March that I would start seeing foreclosures and workouts and defaults on loans, and that really wasn't the case, except in hospitality. Hospitality fell off a cliff. I wasn't really involved in transportation finance and that supply chain, et cetera. But my guess is maybe some of that same effect was felt there. But in my little world, it was the main impact was hospitality, and that did feel like 2008.
Yeah, boy, similarities and differences. I think I'd like to start by talking about the differences, because I think that might be maybe the most important thing that we can all take from this conversation, because the differences actually have been a big reason why this is not 2008. So lots of things happened leading up to 2008 in the capitalization world of commercial real estate. First of all, we were way overbuilt in many sectors. We're really not today. That's a big difference. The second difference is the process of getting a lender or an equity group to approve your transaction is tremendously more difficult and time consuming and tedious today. And by today, I mean the last 10 years than it was leading up to 2008. And to some degree, we find that to be challenging. We wish it wasn't as hard, but that also has meant that more people are looking at a transaction to decide whether or not they want to approve it. And that's probably avoided some deals from getting done that probably shouldn't have gotten done. There is clearly more equity in most deals today than there was before. Lenders are not lending as much, so that has helped. The quality of the borrower has helped. So all of these things have left us with a much better position today than what we had in 2000. 2008. Similarities, or maybe one other difference that I think is important, a massive lesson I think everybody learned from 2008 is if you can just hang in there with your asset, time might cure all wounds, and didn't cure all of them, but it certainly did a lot of them. And so I think that the lending community very quickly this time around was willing to provide abatement of mortgage payments, not forever, but 90 days. And Craig, you would know better than I would, but I think that was largely across the board, particularly in hospitality, because it was clear nobody was going to have cash to make mortgage payments. Now we've got to work our way through that, but these are some big differences that I think are very important for why we'll get through this in much better condition.
Yeah, and just maybe a follow up on that, and just thinking about like some of the stimulus that we had, this time around versus 2008, and kind of the programs that were out. Do you think any of that also had something to do with why things are a little bit more resilient this time around than in 2008?
Well, that might be more of a
clear.
question for Lance than me, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's clearly helped. I don't know that that's saved the day all by itself by any means, but it's clearly been helpful. I sit on the board of a couple of companies that took out PPP loans, and they needed them. And if not for that, who knows where those companies would be today. So, and I'm confident that that is the same for many firms. But as we all know, those were really only a short stopgap measure.
Right.
We got enough money to pay people through the end of June. What's interesting about that is that when that ran out and some of the companies needed people to come back, they've had trouble getting some people to come back to work. But sure, I think it's helped, but I think it's just the resiliency of the economy has maybe brought us through.
I do have to wonder though where the buck stops. I mean, we saw this sort of progression where for instance, just to take an industry segment where tenants got relief from their landlords, and then landlords got relief from their lenders, and did the lenders get relief from the bondholders in the securitization market, and sort of on a broader spectrum, you have this money that was injected into the economy to provide for this soft landing, which I think helped soften it a lot. But I just have to wonder when the piper has got to be paid on some of this stuff.
Yeah, no doubt. We again, I don't want to at all paint the picture that everything's great, because it is not. It's a very difficult environment, but it's nowhere near as bad as it might have been, or as bad as most of us thought it probably would be. There's a lot left to go. We'll see what happens next year, even if the economy continues to improve. As Craig is saying, eventually, my experience is at the end of the day, people who are owed money tend to like to get it paid back to them at some point. So we'll see how that pans out.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we're going to move on to our kind of next section here, which is on financing opportunities and capital structures. And Lance, I'll start with you here. So could you provide your thoughts on the current state of the financial markets? I think particularly, what are your views on, the debt and equity markets, and maybe you can touch on kind of how things are impacting the traditional, focused traditional real estate focused asset classes as well.
Sure. So equity and debt, really two different situations. Neither is bad, but equity has clearly been more abundant, more eager, more active than debt in our view. I would say that there was a lot of equity looking to invest in real estate pre-COVID. There's probably at least as much and maybe more today. And so there's a lot of money looking to invest. What's interesting is immediately when the world sort of paused in mid-March, if we would talk to equity investors, many, maybe most, would tell us that they're going to sit on the sidelines until, and this is what we heard at the end of March, until say end of August, early September, when they were confident we'd have a ton of distress and they would just buy everybody else's problem at massive discounts. That did not happen. And it took about 45 to 60 days for those investors to realize it was not probably going to happen. And then they said, well, then what we'll do is we'll go back and do those new deals, development or acquisitions like we used to, but we'll at least be able to name our terms because nobody else is going to want to do those. And that did not happen. There were a lot of people that wanted to do those. And so it became very, very competitive. And one thing that hit me, I had to be taught this, was all of this equity that historically would invest in all sorts of product types, all of them, today really only wants to do two, apartments and industrial. And so it's funneling into a small segment of the market and has made it very, very competitive. And I know we're going to talk a little bit later about university and partnerships and research parks, which is very important. I think that's very interesting to equity as well. But equity is very, very interested in good deals today and very abundant. That's a little bit different. Craig mentioned earlier, the large money center banks have largely been on the sidelines the last 6 or 7 months. Not totally, but largely they're beginning to creep back in, but it's slow. The regional banks have largely been lending, but more conservatively than they had been before. Some are not lending, most are. But most of them really want to focus on existing client relationships. But you at least see a functioning market. The small community banks, our experience is acting like COVID doesn't even exist, very, very active today. So you see a little bit of a difference between equity and debt. Debt continues to get a little more abundant, terms a little better, but certainly less abundant than pre-COVID, and terms are more conservative.
Mm-hmm. Craig, did you want to add anything?
Well, I'll add just this. I totally agree. The debt in some sectors, in some markets, geographical and other, has disappeared. And it's interesting to watch because we represent a lot of institutional investors that have debt programs and equity programs, and are also willing to do things that sort of sit the fence between those, preferred equity and other things that might have aspects of both. And we've certainly seen those with the ability to do so move from the debt side to the equity side.
Got it. And I guess one follow-up, Lance, is I guess with the uncertainty in, some of these markets, particularly kind of, the debt and so forth, how do you see that impacting, projects like development projects and university projects, that sort of thing?
I think very positively. So in my career, which at this point is about 40 years, most of which has been in financing commercial real estate, it feels like in the last somewhat period of time of those years, real estate capital has had a little bit of a shift from focusing purely on the deal to being almost a little bit more like, say, venture capital in some degrees, in the sense that it's trying to think of where should I invest? What are the industries? What's the future? Where should I put my money? Historically, my experience is real estate capital looks at a deal. And it still does that to a large degree, but it's also thinking, no, I want to look at industries in the future and where should I go? That is a little bit of a difference. And so when you think about it that way, then you look at universities, research parks, high tech. These are all things that just as a layperson immediately hit you as the future, smart stuff, makes sense, where I want to be. And so capital is very interested in trying to figure out how can I do things with universities. I don't think they see a lot of those opportunities yet. I think there's a big opportunity for universities to take advantage of that. But our take is very, very interesting, particularly when some other sectors that they would normally invest in are really not things they want to do today.
Yeah, I guess, and just kind of, moving on, just on our, colleges and university partners, what are, as they're obviously trying to expand their research and technology corridors, in this kind of age of COVID that we're in, I mean, what do you think are some, structures or partnerships that they should be thinking about, or should be considering to kind of help advance their programs?
Craig, you want to start on that one?
Well, yeah, just to backtrack for a half a second, it seems to me, and this is for all intents and purposes, this is a layperson's opinion because I'm outside the legal realm now, but it seems to me that when capital is looking at universities who are likely to be around in the future, therefore probably an attractive source of repayment of credit, coupled with scientific or research or development initiatives, and in the education field, which is probably going to continue and maybe even more so be supported by government in the future. That seems pretty appealing to me. So I would expect that there will be an appetite for that. As far as structures go, there are a lot of private enterprise participants that maybe didn't get that deal done on the speculative new office building or retail center or something like that, that might be now all of a sudden a good partner for a university or foundation in doing something that might not really have been within their smorgasbord of activities before. So I think there probably some opportunities like that, structurally speaking, that are spawned by the economy and the COVID environment.
Yeah, the final thing I'd add on to that, Will, would be that in our experience, it feels like universities are just not sure of what some of the more private capitalization options are that are available for them. Universities generally own great real estate. They're full of very, very smart people. They've got a built-in base of people who want to use the real estate, the students or the administration, whatever it is. It really is set up very, very well for commercial real estate developers to come in and do all these cool things that we all want, these mixed use environments where you can live and work and play, et cetera, with the research component, the technology component. I just don't know that universities have taken advantage of that to the extent that they could. Knowing that universities tend to want to hold on to their land forever. So selling sites would be the way to go, but ground leasing, certainly have seen that. But I think being open to the private development community and what they might be able to do and using private capital sources is a pretty wide open field.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next section, our next topic, and that's around the implications of COVID on real estate contracts and the business of financing. So I'm going to start with Craig on this. One of the things that we started to hear about more is this concept of force majeure and how it connects with how you use it within a pandemic. What does it really mean? Is it something that you can implement or make a claim for? So I mean, maybe Craig, you just maybe broadly just explain to us the basics of like a force majeure clause and how it actually works.
Sure. Yeah. Force majeure really just means major force, act of God, etc. The clauses have been around for a long time, and essentially what they do is they say, in some form or another, they say that if a party's performance under a contract is prevented or delayed or prohibited, those are nuances that we could talk about. But if the party's performance is affected by an act or an event or a circumstance over which they have zero control, and that force prevents them from performing, then there should be some relief. And the relief can take the form of a delay or an excuse, etc. Generally speaking, the way a force majeure clause works is there has to be a force majeure, and that needs to be a circumstance or an occurrence that's outside the party's control and that is unforeseen. That's an important point as well. So unforeseen, outside the party's control, and then depending upon how the clause is crafted, that force might excuse or delay the party's performance if it prevents performance. there's some things, all of a sudden after COVID really struck, and by that I mean in the mid-March time frame, all of a sudden we started getting calls, force majeure, and I don't think I've ever seen the topics pop up on the law firm websites more quickly. This is what how does force majeure affect your, et cetera, et cetera. But it was an active, very, very active situation and area of concern. And a lot of people thought, well, the financial markets sort of seized up. My financing fell through. I was in the middle of a large deal where the financing for the buyer, which unfortunately was my client in that deal, fell through because it wasn't signed up, and the financing source basically said, we're pulling our horns, we're not doing this. They didn't have a commitment, ironclad commitment to do it. We had no financing, and people that were buyers that were in that sort of circumstance all over the country were dialing up their lawyers saying, can I get out of the deal because my financing fell through? And generally speaking, the answer was no. Generally speaking, the cases say that the lack of funds, the unavailability of funding to finance your whatever you promised to do is not an excuse. There could be a particular clause written in a contract that makes it an excuse, but that would look like a typical financing contingency that we see all the time.
Yeah.
I think the only thing I could add to that, and it's not much because I'm not an attorney and Craig is obviously very expert at it, but the concept of, is the buyer going to show up? Is the seller going to perform? Is my equity source really going to close? That has been going on forever. That, COVID didn't make that happen only for the first time. So smart lenders, smart buyers, smart investors have been thinking about this on every deal they have done as long as I've been doing this. And COVID will make them think a little bit more, but really not much. I think you just have to size up. Do you really think you can go? Do I want to have a big non-refundable earnest money deposit on this purchase if I don't have my financing? That's what happened in Craig's client's case, right? So COVID certainly puts a new twist on it, but it's been around, as he said, for some time.
Yeah. Okay, so question for Lance. So just curious, Lance, you're doing a lot of deals. What has been your experience, structuring deals in this, in this COVID environment? I mean, how have things changed, and how's the business shifted? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, maybe pull the curtain back as to how you're looking at things and putting your deals together now.
Sure. I think most simply, to the extent that you want to borrow money, you probably are borrowing a little less than you would have pre-COVID. The guarantee structures are a little more onerous. The pricing is a little more expensive. You can get that for really good deals. For some types of deals, you can't. But that's really the primary shift, I think, on debt. Is it's less abundant, it's a little more expensive, and it's a little lower leverage. And the pressure that puts on the deal on the equity is, if you can't borrow quite as much and what you do borrow is more expensive, it's harder to hit the equity returns that equity is looking for. I don't know that I would say that we've seen a lot of other COVID-induced changes in deal structures. What I would want to mention, though, because we haven't talked about it yet, and I think this is relevant for all of us, but maybe a product type or the product type that is still the least certain on what's going to happen is office product, because we've gone from everybody working from home and thinking that this actually works okay, and maybe this is all we'll ever do forever. And that seems to me to be going out the window. You're seeing many, many major company CEOs say, we're nowhere near as productive working from home as we are from the office. We're going to go back. Now, they'll go back smartly and prudently, but it feels like that's beginning to turn. And that's not, when there's a vaccine, that's just, we need to make it happen somehow. But what does that office building look like in the future? That's really the big question. We're clearly going to be using them, but we probably will space ourselves out a little bit more. We'll get away from the open floor plan, everybody sitting in a bench. Everybody will probably go back to an office, and you'll sit further away. And Maybe you want to be able to open windows, and maybe you want shorter buildings where you can walk up the stairs, and maybe the southeast or west is a little more popular than the northeast, and all those types of things. So to me, office is really the big thing that we have yet as an industry to figure out exactly where that's going, and that does impact how people look at either investing or lending on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might want to invest in office planning companies, because they spent the last 15 years taking the partitions out and putting us all in holding pens, et cetera, et cetera. And now I think Lance is right. I'm not sure that model is going to work. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And then we're starting to bump up against time, so probably final question here. And this is for both of you, and maybe Craig, you start this time, but can you share some of the lessons learned from this kind of recent COVID pandemic, and kind of what you've learned and how you're thinking about doing things differently in the future?
Some years ago, I was involved in some real estate investments in Latin America in a big way, in several different countries. And I had taken the opportunity to sit down with a retired CFO from a public company that my firm had represented. And we had dinner. I'd asked him to dinner because he had experience in a couple of these countries down there, and I wanted to hear from him. And we were having a cocktail before dinner, and he said, "I want to tell you one thing." He said, we were talking about Belize at that point. He said, which is not Latin America, I realized, but that's what we're talking about. And he said, in Belize, nothing is ever as good as it seems or as bad as it seems. And I think that might be, that's sort of my takeaway here, because in late March, I was scared to death. I was on the edge. I wondered whether we would ever have any business again other than foreclosures and workouts. That hasn't happened. However, I think there are clouds on the horizon, some brought on by COVID and some that were gathering anyway. And I'm thinking mostly about retail there, but some other sectors as well. So it's not all sunny sailing either.
Yeah.
I guess for me, maybe I'll say slow down. And let me explain what that means. So as a firm, we're not a huge company, we're 20 people, but we have been very, very busy pre-COVID. We were active, doing a lot of things. That has accelerated dramatically for us. And so this is just a almost grotesque twist of what you would think, but from a business perspective, we are actually benefiting in terms of getting transactions because of COVID. It's just harder to get things done, and that's bringing us business, but it's doing so in an environment where it's always been hard to do deals. It is harder today. And so we can see the stress on our people because we actually have more business than normal, yet it's harder to get done. And they've got their own personal stuff that's difficult. Families, school, elderly parents, whatever it is, and the stress level, if you're not aware of it and what it's doing to your people, it can be very, very difficult on them. So we've tried to intentionally slow things down, and we're not necessarily turning away lots of great business, but we're just trying to be very cognizant of the human impact on this because it is still a very difficult thing.
Excellent. So that is our time, gentlemen. I want to thank you both, Lance and Craig, for your time and being on the panel. Also want to thank AURP for putting this together. We hope you found this session very useful for your real estate, finance, and legal needs. The panelists will be available for questions as well following the session. So thank you all.